The Fog Beneath the Bell-Tree, Part 1. The Village That Breathed. With the wind, the village that time forgot, there is a place far beyond the highways, past the railroads, and deeper still than most maps remember. A place tucked beneath low hills and swaying pine trees, where the air smells of cedar and slow rain, and the sky, no matter the hour, feels like it's on the edge of twilight. The people who live there do not speak quickly. They move like the wind moves, slow and steady, curling around silence rather than pushing through it. And in this village, stories weren't told loudly, they were remembered. Like the feel of smooth stones in your pocket, or the way a certain path in the woods always seemed shorter on the way home. This village didn't have a name anymore. The signpost had faded long ago, and no one saw the need to repaint it. If you asked an elder, they might just smile and say, "We're where the bell-tree grows." And that was enough. A tree that knows when you're near the bell-tree stood at the edge of the forest all. Slender, leafless, yet pulsing with a strange sense of life. Its bark was silver grey, and from its highest branches hung dozens of tiny bells. Some rusted, some shiny, some shaped like animals, stars, or simple circles. No one knew who had put them there. They were always there. The wind would catch them on quiet evenings only, when the sun had just dipped below the hills, and the sound would float across the village like a memory you couldn't place. It wasn't music, not exactly, it was suggestion, a feeling that something wanted to be remembered. And for most people, that was where the story ended. But not for Ellen. Ellen and the evenings of Foglen was not a strange girl. Though others might say so, she never laughed too loud. She never wore shoes unless the ground was frozen. She always carried a pale blue satchel over her shoulder, stitched by her grandmother, with the initials EC tucked in the corner in fading thread. She loved fog more than sunlight, not because it was mysterious, but because it was gentle. It didn't push like sunbeams or roar like thunderstorms. Fog whispered, it rapped, it softened things. Ellen had once said to her grandmother, "When I walk in fog, I feel like I'm inside a thought." Her grandmother didn't ask her what that meant. She just smiled and said, "Then walk slowly, dear. Thoughts can be slippery." Every evening, after her chores, filling water from the well, sweeping the porch, checking the sourberry bush, Ellen would wander toward the edge of the woods, never far, just far enough to see the bell-tree and to listen. She never touched it, never crossed beneath its hanging silver bells. She would just sit on a mossy stone nearby and wait. For what? She didn't know. The night the fog felt different. It was early autumn when it happened. The kind of night where the air smelled of leaves that hadn't fallen yet, and the wind carried just a hint of wood smoke from a neighbor's fire. Ellen had gone to the tree as usual, but the fog that night didn't roll in from the hills like it always did. It rose from the earth. It seeped through the roots, curled around her feet, and climbed slowly, quietly, up her legs. It wasn't cold, it wasn't warm, it wasn't anything. It was a presence. She didn't move, she wasn't afraid. Not at first, but then the bells rang, all of them at once, and not with the soft, sleepy jingling she knew, but with clarity, like they had decided to speak. She looked up. The tree seemed taller than it ever had before. Its branches stretched wider, the bells gleaming in the dim light like tiny moons. She took a step back, and the fog pulled with her, like it didn't want to let go. And then she heard it. A whisper. It came not from the sky or the tree, but from within the fog itself. It said only one word. Wait. Then everything went silent. The empty morning, the next morning, Ellen was gone. Her porch was swept. Her bucket was by the well. Her satchel hung on its hook, but she was not there. They searched the path. They searched the woods. They called her name past the bell-tree, into the fog, into the silence. But all they found was one bell, lying in the dirt, clean, untouched by rust, perfectly round, and still softly ringing, though there was no wind. Part 2. What Ellen remembered in silence for days after her return. Ellen remained mostly quiet. She helped with the same chores, sweeping the porch, carrying water, but she moved more slowly, as if her thoughts had become heavy and wide, like the fog itself. She no longer waited by the bell-tree. She didn't need to at night. She would sit outside her grandmother's cottage, wrapped in a thick wool shawl, gazing at the trees. The bells sometimes rang, sometimes not, but her eyes would always drift to the same place, the clearing where the moss grew deepest, and once in a while, if the night was quiet enough and the winds slow enough, she would hum a tune no one recognized. Her grandmother didn't press. Her memories are like tea, she said once, stirring a steaming cup. Too hot and they burn, too cold and they lose their flavor. You have to let them steep. One evening, as stars began to prick the sky, Ellen spoke without being asked. It wasn't a dream. Her grandmother nodded. Ellen continued, voice calm. I walked, but not with my feet. I floated, but not through air. It was like falling slowly into a memory that didn't belong to me. What did you see? Her grandmother asked softly. Ellen looked at the darkening woods, a house made of bark and smoke, a man with no face playing a flute made of light, a pond that reflected not who you were, but who you could have been, and something else. She trailed off, the feeling that the forest was listening, that it had always been listening. Her grandmother sipped her tea, then said, "Some places are made of earth, others are made of time, and a few are made of memory." In the days that followed, the village returned to its rhythm. Children played. The baker sang. The blacksmith's forge glowed bright. But something had changed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even clear. But people noticed the wind lingered longer near the bell-tree. That fog rolled in even on warm days. And sometimes, when walking alone, they felt watched but gently, as if by something curious, not cruel. The bell-tree never stopped ringing completely after Ellen's return. It rang less, but more meaningfully, almost like it chose when and for whom, and Ellen began to write in a small leather-bound journal her grandmother gave her. She began to draw the house of bark, the man of light, the path she took, not a road, not a trail, but a feeling. She called it the way between. Part 3. The sound between bells. The village returned to its slow rhythm, but something had changed. Not in the air, nor in the trees, not even in the people, but in the space between things. The quiet was quieter. The bells, though untouched, no longer chimed the same, and the fog seemed to remember each evening, as twilight brushed the sky with faded lilac and silver. The mist would drift in earlier sooner than it should, clinging to windowsills and hanging just a little longer at the doorsteps. Ellen's home remained undisturbed. Her grandmother swept the porch. The well was still full. Birds still nested in the hedges, but no one crossed the path near the bell-tree, not any more. The whisper in the water on the third day after Ellen vanished. The baker's daughter merit to fetch water before sunrise. She had always been an early riser, more out of habit than choice. The sky was still dusky blue, and the fog curled like breath over the stone path. Merritt bent over the well, letting down the bucket as usual, until she heard something not sharp, not loud, but soft. Like a sigh across water, she froze. There it was again. Come, ... home, ... She turned quickly, thinking someone stood behind her, but no one did. Only the fog when she looked into the well. She didn't see water, not immediately. She saw a shimmer like moonlight trapped beneath the surface, then a ripple, and then her own reflection again, wide-eyed and still. She didn't tell anyone, not right away, but she drew the water, walked home quietly, and that night she dreamed of silver trees and falling bells, the bell that didn't belong that same evening. The village carpenter hold. Garrett wandered past the herb garden behind the chapel, something he hadn't done in years. His knees ached, his hands shook from age, but something tugged at him like a memory he hadn't had yet. And there, nestled beneath a patch of sleeping lavender, he found it, a bell, not rusted, not worn, smooth, round, and unlike any he'd ever seen before. He picked it up slowly, and as he did, the air around him seemed to still. The leaves paused in their rustling, the insects quieted, the wind drew in a breath and held it, and then a soft sound, a single, unmistakable chime. But it hadn't come from the bell in his hand, it came from beneath the ground. A pattern of presence by the end of that week. 4 more bells had appeared, always at dusk, always placed gently, as if they had not fallen, but been given. And the strange part, no 2 were the same. One looked like a teardrop, carved from bone-white stone. Another was blue glass, with delicate silver veins inside. The third was made of tightly woven twigs that shouldn't have been able to hold sound, but it rang clearer than any church bell. The fourth, it had no shape at all, just a sphere of warmth, vibrating gently, like a memory wrapped in sound. No one claimed them, no one understood them, but everyone remembered ELEN, and with each new bell, the fog seemed thicker, not heavier, just closer. The grandmother's dream on the 7th night. Ellen's grandmother May had a dream. She stood in the forest, barefoot, wrapped in her old shawl. The beltree towered above her, but its bells were still silent. Then the fog parted, and Ellen stepped forward, older, taller, her eyes shimmering like the surface of deep water. May tried to speak, but no words came. Ellen didn't speak either. She just held out her hand, and in her palm sat a bell knot, made of metal or glass, but of light, a soft, pulsing light that seemed to echo like a heartbeat. When May reached to touch it, the dream dissolved into silver rain, and she awoke with tears on her cheeks. The beltree speaks the very next evening. Just after sunset, the bells on the ancient tree rang, but this time they formed a melody, slow, intentional, like a lullaby played by wind and time itself. Everyone in the village paused. Doors opened, windows creaked, feet shuffled onto stone steps, and for the first time since Ellen's disappearance, no one spoke. They only listened. The song continued for nearly 7 minutes, no more, no less. When it ended, the fog retreated just slightly, and one final bell was found. This one was different. It was marked on its side. Etched faintly in what looked like starlight were 3 small letters, ECLELEN's full initials, but the last letter no one recognized. Part 4. where bells become footsteps, a village that waited differently after the marked bell was found. The village no longer whispered about Ellen, they listened for her. Windows were left open longer into the night. Lamps were lit, but dimmed, and each household, without ever agreeing to it aloud, placed a small item by their doorstep before dusk. Some left bread, some left small drawings, some a single button or polished stone. Not gifts, exactly. Not offerings, just ... acknowledgements. Tiny reminders that someone remembered, someone believed, because somehow they all sensed it. Ellen was not lost. She was becoming something else. The fog follows the brave. It was quiet. Meritagan, who first noticed the footprints. They weren't deep, weren't shaped like boots or bare feet, but when the fog hung heavy enough at twilight, they appeared in the dew along the outer path, gentle, dense, perfectly spaced, like someone walking. But here's the strange part. The footprints didn't lead into the woods. They came out and stopped, right beside the bell tree, the record keeper in the village. One man lived higher up the hill than the rest. Mr. Dorian, elderly, widowed, eyes like river stones and hands, always stained with ink. He had kept records of weather, harvest cycles, births and deaths for over 50 years, and after the 8th bell was found, he began a new journal, a bell log. Each night he would sit with his chair angled just so, peering through his window with a brass spyglass focused on the bell tree, and he wrote every single sound. One night he heard 3 chimes, all soft, all low, then silence, then a faint laugh, or at least what he thought was a laugh. It came not from the forest, but from behind him. When he turned, no one was there, only his old cat, curled in sleep by the fire. But when he returned to his notes, the last line was no longer in his handwriting. I am closer now. Dreams in silver ink. By the 10th night, nearly every child in the village began to dream of bells, not loud, jarring bells, but gentle tones, like faraway echoes wrapped in velvet in the dreams. The children wandered in a forest of silver trees, bare and glowing from within. The ground was soft, like clouds. The fog brushed their ankles like silk. And always, always, they would see her Ellen just at the edge of sight. She never waved, she never spoke, but she watched, and when the children woke, they felt rested, peaceful, but always with one clear sentence in their head. The forest is not a place, it's a memory. The bell in the chapel on the 11th evening, as the sky shifted from violet to ink, a new bell was discovered, not outside, but inside, in the small wooden chapel built by the villagers' great-grandparents, hanging from the old prayer rail, was a bell unlike any seen before, made of what looked like woven mist, though solid to the touch. No one had entered the chapel that day. The doors had remained closed, and yet there it was. When the bell was rung, the entire chapel filled with the scent of pine, lavender, and something else, ... candle smoke, the kind Ellen's grandmother used to burn during the harvest solstice. Something ancient awakes on the 12th night. The fog came before sunset. It rolled in early, swallowing fences and garden paths in silence, and the bell tree. It no longer stood alone. 2 smaller trees, pale and new, had begun to grow beside it. No leaves, no branches, but tiny buds of silver, and above them, in the fading light, shimmered a single thread of moonlight, like the beginning of a path. No one dared step toward it, not yet, but the entire village stood outside. Quietly, hand in hand, watching, listening, because somewhere in the distance, footsteps were finally returning. Part 5. The path that waited for moonlight where dreams began to echo that night. The village didn't sleep, not from fear, but from anticipation, the kind you feel before the first snowfall, or when a letter arrives with your name on it in a handwriting you don't recognize. The children were the first to feel it. They lay in their beds, tucked beneath thick quilts, but none of them drifted into dreams the way they used to. Their eyes closed, their breath slowed, but something held them in that space between waking and sleeping. It was warm there, still, and filled with a soft, pulsing sound, like a heartbeat wrapped in fog. They saw her again. This time, she stood closer and she spoke, but her voice was not heard with ears. It moved inside them. The door is open, you may follow, if your heart remembers how to walk slow. The bell tree becomes a gate-bee morning. The two new trees beside the bell tree had grown taller, no longer saplings. Their silver buds had opened, revealing small threads of crystal, delicate and humming. The villagers gathered in silence, forming a circle, not from instruction, but instinct. The trees stood like three sisters ancient, present and becoming dot, and at their feet, where fog once pooled, now lay a path. It shimmered faintly in the morning sun, just wide enough for one person to walk at a time. Not stone, not dirt, something softer. Like woven mist and memory, it stretched forward, disappearing into the woods. May steps forward. Welland's grandmother May stood at the edge of the path. She wore her oldest shawl, woven from dust-colored wool, and carried a small bell in her hand. The very first one Ellen had ever touched. No one told her to go. No one tried to stop her. She looked back at the village, her eyes soft but sure, and said only, "I'll walk slowly. That's how you find the way back." And she stepped onto the path. The bells above sang just once, low, harmonious, and the fog welcomed her like an old friend. The walk between moments me walked for what felt like no time at all and forever. The forest shifted around her, not through space, but emotion. Each step felt like a memory remembered, the weight of Ellen as a newborn in her arms, the sound of her daughter's laughter long before the girl was lost to winter, the way the bell tree once looked when it had leaves, golden and wide. She did not cry. She only walked, one foot after the other, as the path gently curled deeper into silence. And then she saw it, a clearing, bathed in soft silver light, and Ellen, sitting cross-legged, eyes closed, surrounded by tiny bells that floated like fireflies. A place made of stillness. Ellen opened her eyes as May approached. She didn't speak, not at first, but when she did, her voice was older, not aged, but anchored, like the sound of wind beneath deep water. "I've been listening," she said, "to the forest, to what it remembers." May nodded. She sat beside her granddaughter, the moss beneath them warm and welcoming. For a long time, they simply sat. No questions, no explanations, because here, in this place woven from fog and memory, understanding didn't require answers, only presence. The telling of the bells. Ellen eventually lifted her hand, and from her palm a bell rose, a small orb of golden mist. "Each bell holds a moment someone forgot," she whispered. "When they're remembered, the bell returns to the world." May understood. She didn't ask how. She only reached into her shawl pocket and pulled out a piece of thread, a soft blue wand from a sweater Ellen wore when she was 3. She tied it gently to the floating bell, and it chimed, a soft, loving tone. that melted into the clearing like candlelight. Ellen smiled. The return begins, May stood. Ellen stood beside her. They did not walk quickly. The forest seemed to part for them not physically, but emotionally. As they reached the edge of the path, the shimmer began to fade behind them, but not disappear. A trace remained, an echo, and when the two figures stepped back into the village, one old, one timeless, the fog lifted gently. The villagers, still in quiet reverence, did not cheer. They did not rush forward. They simply waited until Ellen, with calm eyes and steady voice, said, "The forest remembers all of you, and now so do I." Part 6. The Memory Grove. Where the forest breathes differently after Ellen and May returned. The village changed, but not in ways you could write down. The fog still came each evening, but it no longer clung with uncertainty. Now it drifted like a soft blanket, protective, watchful. The bells still rang, but they rang with warmth, and people began to dream together. They would wake up and tell the same stories, dreams of walking among tall trees glowing from the inside, dreams of finding objects they'd once lost, buttons, ribbons, even forgotten words, and always, always, the sound of gentle bells in the background, like a soft heartbeat. The village was no longer just a place on a map. It had become a memory shared. The grove appears one morning, after an unusually still night. The children were the first to notice a change in the woods. A new grove had appeared, not grown, not planted, but revealed. It sat just beyond the bell tree, down a gentle slope that hadn't existed the day before. Within the grove stood 7 trees, each different, some with leaves of silver, some without leaves at all. At the base of each tree lay a bell, softly glowing. Ellen called it the Memory Grove. She explained that each bell marked a memory long forgotten, waiting to return. "They're not my memories," she said. "They belong to us all." The first gathering that evening, for the first time in the village's long history, every family gathered in the grove, not for celebration, not for mourning, simply for presence. No one spoke loudly. No one played music. There was only stillness and the soft chimes of the wind. One by one, people approached the trees and touched the bells. And as they did, they remembered. A father recalled the smell of his mother's bread after a snowstorm. A child remembered the lullaby her grandfather hummed before he passed. An old woman remembered the name of the flower her husband gave her every spring, and every time someone remembered, the bell beside their tree glowed brighter, not hot, not harsh, just warm. Ellen's gift. At the center of the grove stood the 8th tree, taller than the rest. It hadn't been there the night before. Its trunk shimmered with threads of deep blue and silver, and at its base sat no bell dot. Instead, there was a pool, clear, still, like glass. Ellen led May to the edge of the water and knelt. She whispered into the pool, and for a brief moment, everyone saw a vision ripple across its surface. Ellen as a child, running through fields. Her mother, now long gone, braiding her hair. May holding her as an infant under the stars. Then the image faded. "This pool holds all that we've shared," Ellen said, "so we never lose it again." She called it the heart reflection, where waking and dreaming meet from that day on. The memory grove became part of life. Children played among the trees by day, and the elders sat quietly by night, whispering old tales that drifted into the soil. No one feared forgetting anymore, because now memories had a place to return to. Even the bell tree once mysterious and distant, now stood like an old friend guarding the edge of dreams. And Ellen, she didn't speak much. She didn't need to. She simply listened, walking the grove in quiet steps, tending to the bells, the trees, and the soft fog that still curled gently across the village each dusk. The night the bells went silent, and then, one night, something new happened. The fog arrived, as always. The people gathered, as they often did, but the bells, ... fell silent. Not because something was wrong, but because, for the first time, ... everything had been remembered. Part 7. The day the wind rested the morning after silence. When the villagers awoke the next morning, the world felt different. The wind didn't blow, not even a breeze. The trees didn't rustle. The bells didn't ring. And yet, no, one was afraid. In fact, there was a stillness in the air so deep, so peaceful. It felt like the entire village had exhaled together for the first time in years. Children woke slowly, without rush. Old men sat on their porches in quiet reflection. The bakers' ovens warmed the air with soft spice and bread, and even the birds seemed to sing a little more softly. The silence from the bells wasn't absence. It was completion, a gentle pause, before something new. The letters without ink letter that afternoon. The youngest child in the village, a girl named Lenry, found something unusual by her windowsill. A folded piece of paper, old and soft, but blank. When she touched it, warmth spread into her fingers. She closed her eyes, and in her mind she heard a voice, not words, but a feeling. It was Elen, not standing, not speaking, but present. And though the paper remained blank, Lenry somehow knew what it meant. Your story begins when you're ready, and the bell will find you when it's time. One by one, others began to find the same letters. No writing, no marks, just stillness and a quiet invitation to remember. May's final thread. Ellen's grandmother, May, had begun weaving against something she hadn't done in years. She used thread dyed with water, and her fingers, though wrinkled, moved like rivers over stone. She wasn't making clothing, or cloth, or bags. She was weaving a path. Each morning she would walk to the bell tree, sit beneath its branches, and add to the pattern. It trailed behind her like a soft ribbon of memory. People didn't step on it. They simply walked beside it. By the time the autumn leaves had turned gold, the woven path reached the grove, and on its last day, May tied the final knot, then rested her hand against the bell tree. Now she won't need to guide us, she whispered. We remember the way. That evening, she didn't return to her house. She had gone to sleep beneath the branches, a bell in her palm, and a smile on her face. In the morning, the path shimmered brighter, and the bells rang not for mourning but for honor. Ellen walks beyond. Ellen knew her time with the village was changing, not ending, just shifting. She had become part of something greater than one place, one grove, or one name. She now belonged to all who remembered. So one night, after the bells rang with laughter and stories filled the twilight air, she walked the path May had, woven barefoot and unhurried past the grove, past the bell tree, into a new stretch of forest where no fog hung, but every leaf shimmered like memory. She did not disappear, she simply continued, and the villagers, they smiled, because they knew she had not left. She had become the bell that rings when we remember. And then the wind returned on the 7th day after Ellen's walk. The wind came back, it rustled the trees, gently lifted curtains, sang through chimneys and kissed every bell in the village with just enough touch to make them sing not a song of sadness, not of mystery, but of peace. Part 8. The bell that lives in Silence village, that carried the forest inside. Seasons passed, as they always do. Snow softened rooftops, spring crept in with bright moss and wildflowers, and through it all, the village thrived not in noise, not in size, but in stillness. There were no tourists, no maps, just memories. The path May had woven faded gently into the ground, as if the earth had learned it by heart. The bell tree now stood surrounded, not alone but accompanied by children's drawings, carved symbols of gratitude and circles, of pebbles placed there by quiet hands. People no longer feared forgetting. They had learned how to remember gently, and that made all the difference. The bells that weren't hung in time. New bells began to appear not from the trees, but from people. A mother found one tied to her baby's blanket. An old man felt one drop into his coat pocket during a quiet walk. A painter woke to find a small golden bell resting on his brush. But these bells made no sound, at least, not in the air. They rang only when someone touched them with meaning, when the heart remembered something true, something once lost. The bell hummed gently, not loud, not sharp, just enough to say, yes, that part of you is still here. The fog finds new homes. The fog, once only a visitor from the hills, began to settle differently. It no longer waited at the edge of the forest now it appeared, in the quiet moment before sleep, in the warmth between two people holding hands, in the hush of a final goodbye, or the softness of a hello. The villagers came to understand. The fog was never a danger. It was a memory, looking for a home, and they had become its home. The storytellers, baloney evening. Long after Ellen had walked into the deeper woods, a boy named Sam stood by the bell tree holding a journal. He wasn't old, not a leader, just someone who listened well. He began to speak not loudly, but with the tone of someone opening a door. He told the story of Ellen. He told it slowly, like braiding thread. He used pauses like commas and silences like poetry. And when he finished, he did not close the book. He hung it from the bell tree, tied gently by a string of soft blue wool. The bell beside it rang just once, and then silence, a silence that meant everything had landed exactly where it should. The final gift, one night. Every house in the village heard it at once. A chime not from the bell tree, or the grove, or even the wind. It came from within. A bell inside the chest, a note so soft. It couldn't be recorded, only felt, and with it came a whisper, not Ellen's, not anyone's, but the forest itself. Thank you for remembering me. No one replied aloud, but many closed their eyes. Some smiled, some wept. All slept deeply that night, a place that no longer needs to be found. And so, the story of the bell tree came to rest not in history books, or legends, or carved stones, but in the way the village walked, in the quiet way they waited for each other, in the bells they wore gently around their hearts, and in the fog that no longer needed to hide. For once you learn to remember with kindness, ... you never forget again. Part 9. When the bell sleeps to the year, the bells rested as time passed. The village no longer counted days. Seasons became feelings rather than calendars. Spring smelled like warm moss. Autumn felt like stories told beside windows. And the bells, they still existed. But they no longer needed to ring. They had become part of the people. Some were worn as pendants. Some were placed in jars beside beds. Some lived quietly in the corners of books, waiting for a page to turn. They no longer needed to chime to be real. Their sound lived in memory now, and memory, in this village, never walked alone. The return of Ellen, not as before, many years later, though no one really measured how many, on a morning of silver fog and whispering trees. A traveller approached the village. She was not young, not old. Her steps were soft but sure. She wore a coat woven from threads of many colours, none too bright. Around her neck hung a bell. It did not ring, but the moment she passed the old stone marker where the village sign used to be, a breeze lifted the edges of her coat, and the fog moved just slightly to greet her. No one knew her name, but everyone recognized her eyes. They weren't Ellen's, not exactly, but they carried the same listening, the same quiet, the same remembering. And when she smiled at the beltree, it shimmered not in light, but in stillness. A stillness so perfect, it hummed. The last story never told that night, by a small fire near the edge of the grove. The traveller spoke to no one in particular. She opened a book without title. Its pages were blank, but her voice low, slow, steady, began to fill the air like mist rising. She didn't tell the whole story. She only told the end. There was once a village that knew how to listen, and a tree that waited patiently to be remembered, and a girl who followed the fog, not to get lost, but to bring something home. The children leaned in, but she closed the book gently. The rest, she said, is yours to tell, one memory at a time. And with that she stood. She walked to the bell tree, hung a new bell plane, unmarked, quiet, and for the first time in many years. The bell tree made no sound at all, because it didn't need to. Where the bell sleeps tune now. If you ever find yourself walking through mystical or imagined, and you pause, just for a moment, to feel the hush in the air, if your breath softens, if your heart slows, if you feel as though something knows you've arrived, ... you may be near a bell that once belonged to this story. You won't need to ring it. You won't need to speak. You'll only need to remember, because some stories don't end. They rest like the wind, like the trees, like the bell beneath your chest, waiting. And now the bell sleeps too.